Nobody saw her coming. Nobody even knew she existed. 43 seconds. That's how long it took for Captain Mason Reed's 12-man assault team to go from confident to dying, pinned beneath cliffs of ice and granite, while machine gun fire shredded the snow around them like paper. The extraction window was closing. Air support was gone. The radio was screaming static. And back at Falcon Command Center, a 4-star general watched his best soldiers bleed out on a glowing tactical monitor with nothing left to offer them but silence. Then the shots started. 1, 2, 3. Each one impossible, each one from over a mile away. Each one dropping an enemy gunner before he could finish the job. Someone was out there in that storm. And nobody, not the general, not the enemy, not even the men being saved, had any idea who. If this story already has you hooked, follow my channel so you never miss what comes next. Hit like and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Black Ridge Mountains did not forgive mistakes. They had a reputation, not the romantic kind that soldiers invented around fires, but the earned kind, written in the freezing deaths of climbers, the lost patrols from 3 wars back, and the navigation errors that turned experienced men into missing persons reports. The ridgeline ran northeast for 60 kilometers through terrain so broken and vertical it barely appeared on most tactical maps. Satellite imagery couldn't penetrate the cloud cover that wrapped the upper elevations for 9 months of the year. Drone reconnaissance came back with footage so degraded by wind interference it was nearly useless. The mountains were a blind spot, a dead zone. Which was exactly why Victor Karev had chosen them. Captain Mason Reed studied the terrain model one more time before the mission brief ended, his finger tracing the insertion route along the valley floor. The holographic display cast pale blue light across the faces of his team. 12 operators, all experienced, none of them young anymore in the way that mattered. They had the kind of age that lived behind the eyes rather than on the skin. Primary route runs through Corridor 7, said the intelligence officer. A narrow-shouldered man named Decker who wore his uniform like it belonged to someone else. Karev's compound sits at Grid 447 on the northern face. Our source confirms he'll be on site until 0300 local. After that, he moves. Your source, Reed said. Not a question, a notation. Decker didn't flinch. Reliable asset, 12 months in place. Reliable assets have bad days. Captain, the window is the window. Command has approved the operation. Reed looked at his team. Staff Sergeant Dominic Falco sat with his arms crossed, jaw working quietly on nothing, the way he always did when he thought something smelled wrong but couldn't identify it yet. Corporal Yates was studying the terrain model with the intense focus of a man memorizing an escape route before he even had one. The others showed their own variations of controlled tension. Not fear, but the calibrated alertness of people who had done this enough to know that confidence and certainty were two different things. What's the weather window? Reed asked. Storm system is tracking east. You'll have approximately 4 hours of manageable conditions before it hits the ridge. Approximately. Yes, Captain, approximately. Reed looked at the terrain model again. 4 hours. Insertion, infiltration, target acquisition, extraction. Tight but workable if everything went smoothly. He had learned, over 11 years and 4 combat deployments, to treat the phrase "if everything went smoothly" the way a demolitions expert treated an unfamiliar wire, with deep suspicion and careful hands. But the orders were signed. The window was open. Gear check in 20, he said. We move at midnight. The helicopters dropped them 3 kilometers south of the target grid, well outside any plausible detection range. The pilots didn't linger. The moment boots touched snow, the aircraft banked hard and disappeared back into the darkness. The sound of rotors faded fast, swallowed by wind and altitude, and then it was just 12 men standing in the dark with their breath fogging in the beam of a red-filtered headlamp. Reed clicked the lamp off immediately. Go to Naudes, he said quietly into the team channel. Standard stagger. Falco, you're on point. Yates, rear security. Nobody fires unless I call it, or we're compromised. 12 sets of night vision monoculars rotated down into position. The world went green and grainy and cold. They moved. The valley floor was deceptive. It looked open on the terrain model, but the actual ground was fractured by frozen creek beds and tumbled rock formations that forced constant micro-route adjustments. Falco picked the path with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had walked bad ground in the dark more times than he could count. The team flowed behind him in loose, staggered column, maintaining interval, checking sectors, communicating in clicks and hand signals. Reed kept his eyes on the northern ridgeline. Something bothered him. He couldn't name it. The feeling sat in his chest like a cold coin, turning slowly. The terrain model had shown the cliff faces on both sides of the corridor as sheer and unclimbable, exposed granite with minimal cover, clean fields of fire from the valley floor. Good news for a team moving through, but he kept looking at the ridgeline anyway, his gut insisting on something his eyes couldn't confirm. They were 2 kilometers out when Falco raised a fist. The column froze. Reed moved forward in a low crouch, pressing up beside his point man. Falco said nothing, just touched his own eyes and pointed toward a shallow rock formation at 11 o'clock. Reed shifted his nods and studied the position. Nothing moved. But the snow around the formation was disturbed, not by wind, which would have created uniform drift patterns, but by something heavier and less predictable. Boots, possibly. Or equipment being repositioned. Reed held up 4 fingers, pointed at the formation, then spread his hand flat. Hold. They waited 3 full minutes. The only sound was wind. Then nothing continued to happen, which Reed found almost as unsettling as something happening. Footprint pattern, Falco murmured into the channel. Could be animal. Could be. You believe that? Reed thought about it. No. They bypassed the formation wide to the east, adding 400 meters to the route and cutting into their timeline. Reed noted it, recalculated, decided they could absorb it. The storm was still east. Conditions were holding. They reached the target grid at 0147. 13 minutes ahead of schedule, which almost never happened, and which Reed therefore did not trust. The compound was smaller than the model had suggested. 3 structures arranged in a rough triangle, connected by covered walkways, perimeter lighting on a generator circuit that produced a dim orange glow along the outer fence. 2 guards visible at the main gate. The intelligence file had said 4. Reed counted again. 2. Where are the other 2? He asked into the channel. Could be inside, said Yates from his rear security position. Could be. Could be. Everything was could be tonight. Reed pressed his back against a boulder and thought about the missing guards, the disturbed snow, the terrain model that didn't quite match the actual ground. He thought about Decker's flat certainty, reliable asset, 12 months in place, and how certainty in intelligence work was usually a warning sign rather than a comfort. We're going in, he said. Breach sequence Alpha. Falco and I take the gate. Yates, you hold the southern approach with Torres and Marsh. Everyone else on the structure, non-lethal if possible. Command wants Karev breathing and talking. A low chorus of affirmatives came back through the channel. Move in 90 seconds. He looked at Falco. Falco looked at him. The older man's expression said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. They moved. The breach went clean for approximately 40 seconds. Falco dropped the first guard at the gate with a chokehold before the man could finish turning around. Reed caught the body, controlled the descent, kept it quiet. They were through the gate and moving toward the main structure when the world came apart. It started with a single shot from the eastern cliff face, not aimed at them, but a signal. Reed recognized it instantly for what it was, even as his brain was still processing the sound. Contact, someone shouted over the channel. Multiple contact. East Ridge. East Ridge. The machine guns opened up from 3 points simultaneously. Not from the compound, from the ridgeline. The cliff faces that the terrain model had marked as sheer and unclimbable turned out to be neither. They were riddled with prepared fighting positions, dug into the rock and concealed under camouflage netting that was completely invisible to the drone footage and completely invisible to the satellite imagery because it had been installed months ago, specifically for this moment. Reed hit the ground as the first burst of fire chewed through the snow where he'd been standing. Break contact, fall back to the boulders. The team moved fast and ugly, not the clean tactical withdrawal of a rehearsed drill, but the desperate controlled scramble of people who understood they were in a kill zone and needed to not be in it. Reed counted voices in the channel. 10. 11. Where was 12? "Marsh," he called. Static. Then, "Marsh is down. Marsh is—" The voice cut off. The machine guns kept hammering. From the eastern ridge, from the western cliff, from a third position somewhere north that Reed hadn't identified yet. They had good arcs, overlapping fields of fire that covered the valley floor in 3 directions. Whoever had set this up had done it carefully and patiently, and with the specific intent of leaving no escape route that wasn't also a killing ground. Reed pressed himself against a boulder the size of a truck and tried to think. The compound was behind them. Useless. The valley floor was open. Suicide. The southern approach was where Yates and Torres had been, but he'd lost comms with that position. The northern ridge held the third gun, which meant north was out. "Falco, where are you?" "Rock formation, 10 meters your left." "Can you see the eastern gun?" "I can see the muzzle flash, can't get a shot. Angle's wrong." "What about the western?" "Negative. It's dug in behind a lip. I'd have to be on the ridge to engage it." Reed pulled his radio handset and tried to raise Falcon Command. The transmission dissolved into static before he finished the call sign. He tried again. Static. The storm that was supposed to be tracking east and still 4 hours out, was somewhere much closer than the weather brief had suggested, and it was eating his radio frequencies like paper and water. He switched to the satellite uplink. 1 bar. He typed the contact report manually. 12-button keypad, gloves on, hands shaking from cold rather than fear. Contact, repeat, contact. Grid 447, ambush east and west ridge, requesting CAS immediate. The acknowledgement came back 40 seconds later. Stand by. Weather advisory. CAS unavailable. Reed stared at the screen for 1 full second, then put it away. They were alone. 10. At Falcon Command Center, 230 kilometers south in a heated operations room that smelled of coffee and recirculated air, General Victor Hale stood in front of the tactical display and watched the situation deteriorate with the particular helplessness of a man who had all the authority in the world and none of the options. The blue icons representing Reed's team had clustered into a tight group near the valley center, pinned, immobile, which in combat was another word for dying. The red threat indicators on the ridge showed 3 active fire positions. The weather overlay showed the storm system 3 hours ahead of its predicted track, which was the kind of meteorological error that happened, and which nobody in the room was going to be blamed for, and which was currently going to get 12 of his best operators killed. "Get me air assets," Hale said. "Sir, the storm is—" "I understand what the storm is, Major. Get me something." The watch officer worked the console for 90 seconds, then turned with an expression that didn't require translation. "Nearest available fixed wing is 70 minutes out, sir. Rotaries grounded across the board. The ceiling's dropping fast." Hale looked at the display. He did the math. 70 minutes against a team that was pinned in a kill zone with limited ammunition and at least 1 man already down. "Drone coverage? 2 minutes until we lose the feed entirely. Storm's killing the link." He watched the blue icons. Steady. Holding. Not spreading out, which would have indicated a team maneuvering to break contact. They were genuinely stuck. The geography that Karev had chosen, that someone had chosen, had reduced 12 experienced operators to static targets waiting for their ammunition to run out. Then the eastern machine gun stopped firing. Hale looked up from the console, looked at the display. The gun had been cycling at a consistent rate for 7 minutes. Now it was silent. "Western position also just went quiet," the watch officer said, his voice carefully neutral. Hale said nothing. 30 seconds passed. Then another burst of firing from the valley, but different, shorter, from the team's positions rather than the ridgeline. Answering fire, not incoming. "The northern gun," someone said. "It's—" A pause. "It stopped, sir." The room was quiet. The drone feed was degrading fast, dissolving into visual noise at the edges, but for the next 90 seconds, it showed enough. The blue icons were moving, not scrambling, moving with direction and purpose. Breaking south toward the extraction corridor that had been a killing ground 30 seconds ago. The red threat indicators on the ridgeline had simply stopped being active. "What just happened?" Hale asked. Nobody answered because nobody had an answer. 3 prepared fighting positions, manned, concealed, covering all egress routes, had gone silent in sequence over a period of less than 4 minutes. The fire they'd directed at the valley floor had stopped as completely as if someone had thrown a switch. "Get me read on comms." The communications officer tried for 40 seconds. "Channels degraded, sir. Storm interference, intermittent at best." Hale looked at the display. The blue icons were making ground, moving fast. He watched them cross the 2-kilometer mark toward the extraction point and felt something he couldn't quite name. Not relief, because there were still too many unknowns for relief, but something adjacent to it, closer to the particular dread of someone who has just been saved from a falling object by a stranger and hasn't yet seen the stranger's face. Someone had been out there. Someone with a rifle. Someone who had not been authorized by any order he had signed or any mission plan he had approved, operating alone in a blizzard at elevation during an active enemy contact and making shots at a range and under conditions that were, his operations officer had already quietly done the math and handed him the paper, not supposed to be possible. "Who is on that ridge?" Hale said. The watch officer looked at his screen, at the other screens, at the communications panel. "Sir, we have no assets within 40 kilometers of that position." "I know we have no assets there, Major. That's what I'm asking about." Another silence. On the display, the last blue icon crossed the extraction corridor boundary. Reed's team was out. Every one of them, minus Marsh, who the follow-up traffic would confirm had taken a round in the first 30 seconds and was critical but alive, which was the best possible version of a terrible fact, had made it through. 12 men who should have died in a prepared ambush in the Black Ridge Mountains were walking toward a pickup zone in a blizzard instead. Because of someone Hale couldn't identify, couldn't locate, and hadn't authorized. He picked up the handset for his direct line to Forward Base Orion. "Get my helicopter ready," he said. "I'm going north." The flight took 90 minutes through the outer edge of the storm, and it was not pleasant. Hale sat in the jump seat with his arms braced against the airframe, while the aircraft pitched and rolled and the pilots earned every hour of their flight pay. He didn't speak. His aide, a young lieutenant named Carr, who had learned to read the general's silences, didn't speak either. There was nothing useful to say yet. Hale was thinking about the shots. He had been a soldier for 31 years. He had served in more combat zones than most men his age thought existed. He understood marksmanship, the actual mechanics and limits of it, not the inflated mythology. And he understood what the preliminary data on those shots implied. The eastern gun position was at approximately 1,650 meters from the nearest viable firing position on the opposite ridge. The western position was farther. The northern position was farther still. All 3 engagements had been terminal, meaning not suppressive, not near-miss discouragement, but aimed shots that had neutralized the threat entirely, in a blizzard, at night, from a position that his entire intelligence apparatus had no knowledge of. The helicopter touched down at Forward Base Orion at 0430 in a horizontal snow squall that made the ground crew lean into it like they were walking uphill. Hale was out of the aircraft before the rotors stopped, moving through the base with the particular energy of a general whose anger had not yet found a target but was actively searching for one. Reed met him at the edge of the command tent. The captain looked like what he was. A man who had been in a sustained firefight 3 hours ago, then walked 2 kilometers through a blizzard. His face was raw from the cold, and there was blood on his jacket sleeve that wasn't his, and he stood with the slightly careful posture of someone managing pain they weren't going to mention. "Captain," Hale said. "Sir? Your report said your team was extracted intact minus 1 KIA and WIA, sir. Marsh is alive. Medevac got him 40 minutes ago." Hale noted the correction. WIA. You also reported unidentified fire support from an unknown position. "Yes, sir?" "You have no information on who provided that support." Reed's jaw shifted slightly. "I have a theory, sir." "I don't want a theory right now, Captain. I want the operator who was on that ridge without authorization, who discharged a weapon in a restricted operational area without command approval, and who nearly triggered an international incident by making unsanctioned contact in a classified strike zone." He paused, looked at Reed. "Do you have that, Captain?" A beat. "There's something you need to see, sir," Reed said. In the debriefing tent. The debriefing tent was dim, one work light hanging from the center pole, throwing yellow-orange light that left the corners in shadow, the kind of lighting that made a cold space feel colder. Outside, the wind pressed against the canvas walls with a sound like someone leaning on a door trying to get in. There was a person inside, seated at the far end of the folding table. Hale's first impression was practical rather than dramatic. Someone in field gear, hood still up, working on a weapon. The weapon itself registered before the person did. An enormous anti-materiel rifle, the kind designed to engage light-armored vehicles at extended range, which certain operators used for precision shooting at distances that made conventional sniping look like close-quarters work. The action was open. The person was running a cleaning rod through the barrel with the methodical, unhurried movement of someone who had done this particular task so many times it had become purely mechanical. "Who are you?" Hale said. The cleaning rod moved through the barrel. Once, twice, the hood came down. Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Cross looked up from the weapon with the expression of someone who had expected this meeting and had spent zero time worrying about it. She was lean and weather-burned, with dark circles under steady gray eyes and dust in her hair from a field environment that wasn't this tent. She looked like someone who had recently been lying flat on frozen rock for an extended period, which was because she had been. She set the cleaning rod down and reached into her jacket, placed a credential wallet on the table without theatrics. Hale picked it up, read it again. The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind found a gap in the canvas and made a sound like a low note on something with strings. He had heard of the program. Everyone at his level had heard of it, a classified special operations capability that existed in the organizational space between formal special forces and full deniability, staffed by operators who were selected through a process so stringent that most commanders assumed the program had effectively selected itself out of existence, the kind of thing that appeared in briefings as a footnote and was never discussed in any room with more than 4 people. The crest on her collar was the thing that stopped him completely. He knew that crest. Every senior officer in the service knew that crest. It belonged to Marcus Reyes, the greatest marksman in the history of the program, killed in action 8 years ago during an operation that was still classified at the highest level. The crest was supposed to have been retired with him. It was supposed to be sitting in a display case in the hall of the training facility bearing his name. It was not in a display case. It was on the collar of a woman who had just saved 12 of his operators with a rifle from a position that shouldn't have been possible. "Those were your shots," Hale said. Not a question. "Yes, sir." "From what distance?" "Eastern gun, 1,720 meters. Western, 1940. Northern was the problem. I had a bad angle from the primary position, had to reposition under fire. 1990 to the gun, but the operator was offset from the gun itself. Effective engagement was closer to 2,100. The room didn't react because there was no one in it except Hale Reed, who was standing by the tent entrance with the expression of a man who had already processed his surprise and moved through it, and Evelyn herself, who was delivering those numbers the way a mechanic reports mileage. "You repositioned under fire," Hale said. "The terrain gave me a route to... It was uncomfortable, but it was there." He put the credential wallet back on the table, looked at her for a long moment. The anger that had carried him through the flight north was still present, but it had shifted, changed shape, lost some of its certainty. He was a man who understood the mechanics of command authority and why unauthorized action in a classified operational environment was genuinely dangerous regardless of the outcome. He also understood what 12 dead operators would have looked like. "You acted without authorization," he said. "Yes, sir." "In a classified strike zone." "Yes, sir." "Nearly triggered an international incident." She looked at him steadily. "The incident was already in progress when I engaged, sir. I didn't trigger it, I ended it." The wind hit the tent wall. The work light swayed slightly, and the shadows moved. "You're going to explain to me," Hale said slowly, exactly how you came to be on that ridge. And why. And who authorized your presence in this operational area. And you're going to do it right now." Evelyn Cross looked at the cleaning rod on the table, then back at him. "I'll tell you how I got there," she said. "But before I do, General, I need you to understand something. The ambush tonight, the prepared positions, the intelligence leak, The fact that Karev's people knew exactly which corridor your team was using and exactly when, that didn't happen because of a bad source. Reed shifted slightly by the 10 entrance. Captain Reed's team didn't walk into an ambush because your intelligence failed, she said. They walked into it because someone made sure the intelligence would fail. She paused, one beat, precise as a trigger pull. Someone inside your command gave Karev everything he needed to set that trap, and I can prove it. She reached into the inner pocket of her jacket and placed a small encrypted drive on the table between them. The work light swayed again. Outside, the wind was building, and somewhere beyond the wall of the tent, in the frozen dark of forward base Orion, a set of footsteps that didn't belong to any of them moved quickly and quietly away from the debriefing tent toward the communications building. The trap hadn't sprung yet, but the man who had set it had just realized he was running out of time. Hale picked up the drive without touching the edges. Old habit, the kind that outlasted the reasoning behind it, and turned it over once in his fingers. It was a standard encrypted military format, the casing scratched and scuffed in the way of something carried in a field environment rather than a desk drawer. Whatever was on it had traveled rough. "How long have you had this?" he asked. 11 days. 11 days? He set it back on the table. "And you brought it here. Tonight. After shooting 3 enemy gun positions from positions that shouldn't exist, in a blizzard, without telling anyone you were coming." "I told people," Evelyn said. "Just not the people in this room." Hale's jaw tightened. "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have right now that won't compromise an active source." Reed was still standing at the tent entrance, and he had the careful stillness of a man who is listening very hard to something being said between the words. He'd been doing that since the moment the general had walked in. Watching Evelyn, watching Hale, doing the math on a situation that kept producing numbers he hadn't expected. "General," Reed said quietly. Hale looked at him. "The footsteps," Reed said. "Outside. About 2 minutes ago." Hale turned, looked at the tent wall as if he could see through it. "What footsteps?" "Someone was standing outside this tent, listening. They moved off toward the comm building when she mentioned the drive." The tent was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then Hale turned to the aide who had followed him in and stood near the entrance pole. "Carr, get security to the communications building right now. Nobody in or out until I authorize it personally. Go." Carr was out of the tent before the order finished. Hale looked back at Evelyn. Something had shifted in his posture, not softer exactly, but differently hard, like a man who has just confirmed a suspicion he had been hoping was wrong. "Start talking," he said. "All of it." She talked for 22 minutes. She did not pace. She did not raise her voice. She sat at the folding table with her hands resting near the cleaned rifle and spoke in the measured, sequential way of someone who had rehearsed the order of information, not the words, and trusted herself to find the words as she went. Hale stood. Reed moved from the entrance to the side of the tent, near the table, and listened without interrupting. The story she told was not simple, which was one of the things that made it credible. Simple stories, clean narratives with clear heroes and obvious villains, were usually constructed after the fact by people with something to prove. What Evelyn described was the messy, indirect, frustrating process of watching something go wrong from a distance and not being able to stop it through official channels, because the official channels were part of what had gone wrong. 14 months ago, a low-level signals intercept had flagged an anomaly in the communications pattern between a mid-level asset in the Karev network and a domestic military address. Not a dramatic red flag, the kind of thing that could easily be explained as encryption error or metadata artifact. It had been reviewed and filed and not escalated, which was the normal outcome for that kind of ambiguous signal. Evelyn had been running a parallel operation against the Karev network from a different angle, tracking the financial logistics of his arms supply chain, and the same anomaly had appeared in her data from a different direction. 2 independent data sets pointing at the same artifact. She had brought it to her program director. Her program director had taken it up the chain. The chain had determined, after review, that the anomaly was within acceptable noise parameters and did not warrant further investigation. 3 months later, a different team operating on Karev-adjacent intelligence had been compromised. 2 operators lost. The incident had been attributed to tradecraft failure. Evelyn had pulled the original anomaly file. Then she had started looking at it differently. not as a signals artifact, but as a pattern. And the pattern, once she knew what she was looking at, was not ambiguous at all. Someone with access to operational planning at the command level was passing information. Not bulk intelligence dumps, nothing so obvious, small, specific pieces. Departure windows, route confirmations, the kind of detail that looked like noise in isolation and looked like a targeting package when you laid it next to the ambush coordinates. I couldn't go through the chain again, she said. If I was right, the chain was contaminated. If I went up the chain and the information got back to whoever was leaking, every source I'd developed over 14 months would be burned, and any operational team working against Karev would be targeted. So you went around the chain, Hale said. I documented what I had. I kept it off network. I waited for an opportunity to get it to someone who wasn't part of the contaminated structure. She looked at him directly. You weren't on the coordination list for this operation, General. You were assigned to it 48 hours before insertion. That's the only reason I'm talking to you instead of... She stopped. Instead of who? She held his gaze. Didn't answer. Hale understood. Didn't like understanding it, but he did. You're saying whoever authorized this operation through the original channel is potentially... I'm saying the data on that drive will speak for itself, Evelyn said. I'm not making accusations I can't back up. Reed had been quiet for a long time. Now he said, The 2 guards. Both of them looked at him. There were supposed to be 4 guards at the compound perimeter, Reed said. We had 2. I flagged it before we breached. Didn't feel right. He paused. If someone was feeding Karev's people our route and timing, they could have repositioned personnel. Put everyone on the ridgeline instead of the perimeter, because they knew we weren't going to make it to the compound. Evelyn nodded once. That's consistent with what I found. Marsh, Reed said. The name came out flat. Marsh is in surgery right now because someone in our own command wanted us dead. Nobody said anything to that. There wasn't anything to say that would have made it better, and the people in the tent were not the kind of people who reached for comfort when truth was available. Hale picked up the encrypted drive again. This time he held on to it. I need a chain of custody record for this, he said. When you acquired the data, how it was stored, who has had access. I'm the only person who's had access. You've been carrying classified intelligence on an unauthorized operation for 11 days. Yes, sir. Alone. Yes, sir. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, how old are you, Commander? The question seemed to catch her slightly off guard. Not the asking of it, but the timing. 34. Marcus Reyes was 41 when he died, Hale said. He was the best shot I ever saw in 30 years of service. I watched him qualify once. I was a colonel. I didn't believe the numbers until I saw it with my own eyes. He looked at the crest on her collar. He earned that in 7 years of operation. Where did you earn it? The tent was quiet. The wind outside had dropped slightly, which made the quiet more present rather than less. He gave it to me, she said. Hale's expression shifted. He was my instructor, Evelyn said. Before the last deployment, he said... She stopped, looked at the rifle, looked back. He said he'd want someone to keep using it, that a crest sitting in a case wasn't doing anyone any good. The silence after that was a different kind, but not tactical, not operational, just human. Reed looked at his boots. Hale set the drive down carefully. Right, Hale said, after a moment. His voice had changed register slightly, still authoritative, but the anger had gone somewhere else. I want this base on alert status. I want the communications building locked down and every outgoing transmission from the last 4 hours logged and held. And I want... The lights went out. Not a flicker, not a gradual fade. All of them, simultaneously, as if a single decision had been made somewhere and executed cleanly. The work light above the table went dark. The ambient glow from the base perimeter lighting that had been leaking through the tent seams disappeared. The space went from dim to black in an instant. Reed moved immediately. Not away from the door, but laterally, putting the supply crates between himself and the tent entrance without making a sound. Old instinct. Don't be where you were when the light was on. Hale said, very quietly, Cross. I hear it, Evelyn said. Outside, footsteps. Not one set. Multiple. Moving with the deliberate spacing of people who were trying to cover an approach from more than one direction and weren't quite quiet enough, because they'd prioritized speed over stealth, which meant they were on a clock. In the dark, Reed heard the sound of Evelyn's rifle being lifted from the table. The action was already clean. She'd just finished it. She hadn't rechambered when she set it down, which meant she was doing it now, and the soft mechanical sound of the bolt cycling was the most precise thing he'd heard all night. "How many exits?" she asked. Her voice was barely above a murmur. "2," Reed said. "Front flap and rear equipment panel." "The rear panel opens which direction?" "West. Opens onto the generator yard." A pause. "The generator yard is where the power went out from." "Yes." "So the rear is where they don't want us to go," she said. Hale, to his credit, had not made a sound since the lights went out. He'd moved, Reed could tell by the changed quality of the air in the space, behind the supply crates on the north side of the tent, which was reasonable field positioning for a man who was unarmed. Reed drew his sidearm. Low ready. He couldn't see anything. He was working purely on audio and memory of the tent layout, which was accurate enough to be useful, but not accurate enough to be comfortable. The footsteps outside stopped. That was worse than the footsteps continuing. Stopped meant they were in position. Stopped meant they were waiting for something. A signal, a count, a moment. Reed counted his own heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. The front flap burst open. The figure came through fast and low, the way people trained to enter hostile structures come through doors. Committed, angled, weapon up. Reed could see the outline against the slightly less dark rectangle of the outside. He had a shot. He didn't take it, because the general was somewhere between him and the entrance, and in the dark, he couldn't be certain of the backstop. He didn't need to take it. The rifle fired. The sound inside the enclosed tent space was enormous. Not just loud, but physically percussive, a pressure wave that Reed felt in his chest and his sinuses simultaneously. The muzzle blast lit the tent interior for a fraction of a second in orange-white light, enough to see the figure in the doorway fold and the table where Evelyn had been sitting, which was now empty because she had moved in the dark to a position Reed hadn't tracked and couldn't have predicted. The echo was still dying when the rear equipment panel blew open. 2 figures. Together, which was a mistake. Stacking in a breach was faster, but it meant the second person was partially blocked by the first, and in the half-second that the first man was making his entry, the second was a step behind and exposed. The rifle fired twice. The sound was different now. 2 shots in rapid succession, the second following the first before the first had fully faded. The recoil between them was controlled in a way that suggested the shooter had not moved her firing position or changed her support between shots, which meant she had been set up for exactly this before it happened. Both figures went down. The tent was filled with smoke and the smell of burning propellant and the high, thin sound of the perimeter alert sirens beginning to cycle up from somewhere across the base. Reed held his position with the sidearm up, breathing through his mouth, waiting for a third entry that didn't come. 5 seconds. 10. The sirens got louder. "Clear," Evelyn said from a position in the tent that Reed still couldn't quite locate in the dark. "Clear," he confirmed. A flashlight came on. Hale, behind the supply crates, using a small tactical light aimed low and away. It threw enough ambient reflection to see by without fully lighting them up as targets. Reed looked at the front entrance, at the rear panel, at the 3 shapes on the ground. "Generator yard," Hale said, standing carefully. "I want eyes on the generator yard." "Already done," Evelyn said. Hale turned the light toward her voice. She was standing in the corner of the tent nearest the rear panel, the rifle lowered but not slung, looking through a gap she'd cut in the canvas with a blade at some point in the last 90 seconds. A gap that gave her a sightline to the generator yard without requiring her to open the panel and silhouette herself against the outside. Reed stared at the gap in the canvas. At the blade she was already putting away. "When did you cut that?" "When the lights went out." He didn't have an answer to that. He looked at Hale. Hale had a similar expression, not quite disbelief, but the recalibrated assessment of a man updating his model in real time. Outside, boots were running. The base alert was fully active now, voices calling across the compound, flashlight beams cutting through the snow. The cavalry arriving after the fact, which was the usual timing. "The drive," Evelyn said. Hale patted his jacket pocket. "Still here. We need to get it to a clean terminal, one that hasn't been on the base network in the last 24 hours. I have an air-gapped system on my aircraft, Hale said. Then we need to get to your aircraft. Reed looked at the three men on the ground. None of them were moving. Two he didn't recognize, private military probably, the kind of contractor footprint that was deniable and disposable. The third was in a base uniform. Forward Base Orion insignia on the shoulder. He crouched down and turned the face toward Hale's light. He didn't recognize the man, but the rank on the collar was clear enough. A senior NCO, which meant access. Access to scheduling, to communications, to the kind of operational detail that a leaker needed to function. You know him? Reed asked. Hale studied the face. His expression didn't change, but his jaw moved in the way of someone pressing back a reaction. He's been on this base for 8 months. Communications section. Reed stood. He had help. These two aren't base personnel. Look at the gear. Someone external sent them. He was just supposed to cut the power and open the doors. Which means someone outside the base knew we were meeting tonight, Evelyn said. She was watching the tent entrance, not the bodies. Whoever sent these three got the information in the last 2 hours, after I made contact. Hale said, which means the leak has real-time communication capability. Yes? Which means they know the attempt failed. Evelyn looked at him. They've known for about 10 minutes, General. The tent was quiet except for the sirens and the approaching footsteps of the response team outside. Reed thought about the change she'd described, the months of careful documentation, the decision to go around the contaminated structure, the 11 days of carrying a drive that someone had apparently been willing to kill for. He thought about the position she'd taken on the ridge, 1,900 meters in a blizzard, alone, with no backup and no authorization, and the shots she'd made from it. Why didn't you go to the Inspector General? He asked. Or JAG? Or there are channels for exactly this situation. Evelyn turned from the tent entrance and looked at him. It was the first time since the lights had come back that she'd looked at anyone with something other than operational focus. Whatever was in her expression wasn't quite pain. It was older than pain. More settled. The first person I went to, she said, was my program director. He took it up the chain and was told to drop it. 6 weeks later, he was reassigned to an administrative posting in a location I'm not authorized to name. She paused. The second person I went to requested 48 hours to evaluate the information. 36 hours later, a source I'd been developing for 9 months was found dead in a safe house. She paused again. I stopped going to people after that. Reed didn't say anything. Neither did Hale. I'm not telling you this because I want sympathy, she said. I'm telling you because you asked, and because you need to understand that the person running this, whoever they are, is not operating reactively. They're fast, they're connected, and they have been burning everything that gets close to them for over a year. She looked at the drive in Hale's pocket. That drive is the only thing that's gotten close without being burned, because nobody knew I had it. Until tonight, Hale said. Until tonight, she confirmed. He buttoned the pocket closed. My aircraft. 5 minutes. The base response team hit the tent entrance in a controlled stack, 4 Marines, weapons up, flashlights blazing. They stopped when they saw the general. Sir, stand down, Hale said. Secure this tent and the 3 individuals on the floor. Nobody in or out, nobody talks. Get me your commanding officer in 2 minutes. He was already moving toward the tent entrance. Commander Cross, Captain Reed, with me. They went out into the dark and the driven snow, the 3 of them walking fast across the compound toward the flight line. Reed pulled his collar up against the wind. Beside him, Evelyn carried the rifle at a loose carry, her eyes moving across the compound perimeter with the automatic habit of someone who was never entirely off duty. 1990, Reed said quietly, without looking at her. What? The Western gun. You said 1,940 meters, in a blizzard, with wind. He kept his eyes forward. I've been shooting for 15 years. That's not a distance anyone should be making those shots at, in those conditions. She walked for a few steps without answering. Marcus used to say the conditions are the same for the shot as they are for the target, she said finally. The wind is moving your round and their cover simultaneously. If you understand the wind well enough to compensate, so is everything else. That sounds like something that's easier to say than to do. Yes, she said. It is. Ahead, the taillights of Hale's aircraft were the only visible light on the flight line. The snow was picking up again. Behind them, across the compound, the response team's radios crackled with traffic that was going to require a lot of reporting and a lot of explanations that nobody in authority was yet prepared to give. Reed thought about Marsh and surgery somewhere, about the ambush, about the 2 missing perimeter guards who'd been repositioned to the ridgeline because someone had been precise enough in their betrayal to arrange even that detail. He thought about Decker, the intelligence officer at the original brief, with his flat certainty and his reliable asset, and he filed the thought away without acting on it, because right now there was an aircraft and an air-gap terminal and a drive that someone had already tried to kill for once tonight. They reached the aircraft. The crew chief looked at the 3 of them, looked at the rifle, looked at the general, and made the professional decision not to ask any of the questions he clearly had. Hale climbed aboard first. Reed followed. Evelyn paused at the foot of the boarding steps and looked back across the base, at the tent with its spill of light from the response team's equipment, at the comms building with its locked doors, at the mountains beyond the perimeter wire that were invisible now in the dark, and the snow, but were absolutely present, the way large and cold things are always present, even when you can't see them. She climbed aboard. The crew chief sealed the door behind her. The aircraft systems hummed to life. Hale was already at the rear workstation, pulling the air-gap terminal from its secure mount, powering it up with the careful hands of a man who understood that what he was about to read was going to change the shape of the next several months of his life. Evelyn sat across from him, the rifle resting across her knees. Reed settled into the jump seat and watched the terminal screen boot through its startup sequence. Old hardware, slow, the kind that prioritized security over speed. The snow hit the aircraft windows in irregular patterns, driven by the wind, sounding like thrown sand. Hale inserted the drive. The terminal processed for 12 seconds. Then the first file opened, and the color left the general's face in a way that Reed had never seen on a man of that rank. Slowly, from the forehead down, like a tide going out, Reed leaned forward to see what was on the screen. The name at the top of the document was not someone he recognized, but the title beneath it was a position he knew very well, and it was 3 levels above the chain of command that had approved tonight's mission. The name on the screen was Brigadier General Arthur Voss. Reed read it twice. Not because he doubted what he was seeing, but because reading something twice is what the brain does when it needs a second to accept information it has already fully processed and is now resisting anyway. Voss, Deputy Director of Joint Intelligence Operations, the man whose office sat 4 floors above the room where tonight's mission had been authorized. The man whose signature appeared on the operational security framework that was supposed to prevent exactly the kind of leak that had nearly killed 12 people in the Black Ridge Mountains 6 hours ago. Hale hadn't moved since the file opened. He was sitting with his forearms on the workstation table and his hands clasped, not gripping, just resting together in the way of a man who is applying physical stillness as a substitute for emotional control. Reed looked at Evelyn. She was watching Hale, not the screen. "You already knew the name," Reed said to her. "Yes." "How long?" 17 days. Hale's hands tightened slightly, then relaxed. "Walk me through it," he said. His voice was level in a way that sounded expensive to maintain. Evelyn leaned forward and reached past him, scrolling through the file index with the practiced ease of someone who had read these documents enough times to know the order. The first direct link is in the 3rd file, Financial. An account in a private institution in a country with no mutual legal assistance treaty with us. Account established 14 months ago, same week the first anomaly appeared in the signal's intercept. The deposits correlate directly with Karev's operational timeline. Not the amounts, the timing. Every time Karev ran a successful operation against an asset we were tracking, a deposit was made within 72 hours. Correlation isn't, Hale started. File 7, she said. Communications metadata. Encrypted traffic from a terminal registered to Voss's secondary office. Not his primary, the secondary one in the annex building that logs to a different server, to an intermediary address that our signals people flagged 18 months ago as a Karev cutout node. 14 contacts over 11 months, each one preceding an operational compromise. Hale opened File 7, read. The aircraft was warm. The environmental systems had come up with the power. But it didn't feel warm. Reed shifted in the jump seat and thought about Decker, the the intelligence officer who had briefed tonight's mission with flat certainty about a reliable asset who had turned out to be perfectly positioned bait. He thought about the original anomaly that had been reviewed and filed and not escalated. He thought about who had reviewed it. "There's more," Evelyn said, not as a warning, but as a statement of fact. File 11 is the one that took the longest to get. It's a communication record from 4 months ago. Voss's aide, a captain named Farrell, requested a complete briefing package on Reed's unit. Training records, operational history, personnel files. Standard format for mission assignment review. But Reed's unit wasn't being considered for any mission that week. Reed heard his own name and felt something cold move through him that wasn't the temperature. "He was building a target package," Reed said. "He was building a target package," Evelyn confirmed. "And he had 4 months to prepare the ambush. The fighting positions in those cliffs, the ones your drone footage missed, those weren't constructed quickly. Someone had to have known the operational corridor and the timeline far enough in advance to dig those positions and supply them without triggering any of the monitoring systems that should have flagged construction activity in a classified zone." The terminal screen was still on File 7. Hale was staring at it, and Reed watched the general's face in the pale light of the display and understood that what he was seeing was not a man processing new information. It was a man processing the implications of information he could no longer push away. "Voss approved my assignment to this operation," Hale said, flat, factual. "Yes, sir." "He approved it 48 hours before insertion." "Yes, sir." "That's not enough time to adjust an ambush if I was an unplanned variable." He paused. "Which means he wanted me there." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's my read." "He wanted me on the ground at Orion," Hale said, working it out in sequence, the way his mind operated, procedurally, one step at a time. "He sends a kill team to Orion after the ambush fails, knowing I'd come north when the mission went wrong. With me and the team both eliminated, no one above Voss's level would have direct knowledge of what happened tonight," Evelyn said. "The kill team's contractor origin makes attribution difficult. The ambush would have been filed as an intelligence failure. Karev's network stays intact. The program I'm attached to has no surviving witnesses to whatever it found." Hale sat back in his chair and pressed the heels of his palms against his eyes for approximately 2 seconds. Then he dropped his hands and looked at the screen again. 2 seconds was apparently the operational budget for that kind of reaction. "Who else has seen these files?" he asked. "No one." "Your program director doesn't know what I found. I've been dark for 11 days. As far as my program is concerned, I'm on unregistered field assignment." "You're a WOL," Reed said. She looked at him. "Technically. That's not a small problem. I'm aware. If this gets disputed, if Voss's lawyers argue the chain of custody, argue you were operating outside authorization." "I know," she said. "That's why I needed someone with 4 stars on their collar to be holding the drive before I walked it into any official process." She looked at Hale. "The moment this enters formal channels, it needs to be under your authority, General. Not mine. Mine is too easy to dismantle." Hale absorbed that without reacting. He understood it. He didn't like it, because what she was describing was the kind of procedural pressure that turns solid evidence into disputed evidence in the hands of the right attorneys, and the kind of attorneys that a 2-star with Voss's connections could access were the right kind. He had seen that happen before. Evidence that was overwhelming on its face, reduced to ambiguity by process, by chain of custody arguments, by the systematic exploitation of every technical imperfection in how it had been obtained. He pulled the drive from the terminal port, held it. "I need to make a call," he said. "Secure line. There's someone at the Inspector General's office, not the office itself, one specific person, who I trust enough to contact at 0500 about this." "One person," Evelyn said. "One. Make sure no one else in that office knows the call is happening." He looked at her. "I understand operational security, Commander." "I know you do, sir. I'm saying it anyway because the last time someone made a call they thought was secure, a source ended up dead." Hale held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and moved toward the front of the aircraft to use the hardened communications suite. Reed waited until the general was out of earshot, then said quietly, "You should have gone to him directly. 11 days ago, before tonight." Evelyn looked out the aircraft window at the snow in the dark. I didn't know he wasn't on the original coordination list until 9 days ago, and I needed 2 more days to get File 11. Marsh has been in surgery for 4 hours. She turned from the window. Her expression didn't collapse. It just became more specific. The way a controlled person's face goes when they encounter the exact shape of the cost of something they've been managing with operational distance. I know, she said. I'm not blaming you, Reed said. I'm telling you because you should know. His wife is going to get a phone call in. He looked at his watch. Probably already has. She didn't look away, didn't offer anything in return, which was the right call. There was nothing to offer that wouldn't have been false comfort, and they were both too tired for that. He'll make it, Reed said. The medevac got to him in time. They told me that before I walked into the tent. He paused. I'm telling you that too. She looked at him for a moment. A brief, direct look that was the closest thing to a thank you she appeared to be configured to express. Then she looked back at the window. Hale's call took 19 minutes. Reed and Evelyn sat in the rear of the aircraft and didn't speak much. She field-stripped a component of the rifle she wasn't satisfied with and inspected it under the cabin light with the kind of focused attention that was its own form of patience. Reed drank cold coffee from a thermos someone had left in the seat pocket and thought about the 12 men who'd been on that valley floor 6 hours ago. When Hale came back, his face had settled into something that looked like resolution. The kind that comes after a decision has been made that cannot be unmade. We're moving, he said. All 3 of us. My IG contact is meeting us at a secure facility 300 kilometers south. Clean building, no connection to Voss's chain, full forensic capability to process the drive properly. He looked at Evelyn. You're going to need to give a formal statement, on record. Everything. Your operation, how you obtained the files, the 11 days, the ridge, tonight, all of it. I know. Your program director is going to be notified of your status. That's not negotiable. Understood. And you're going to be suspended from operational activity pending review. He paused. Also not negotiable. She set the rifle component down. Yes, sir. You don't look surprised. I'm not. I violated at least 11 regulations I can name without thinking about it. Probably more I haven't cataloged yet. 14, Reed said. Both of them looked at him. I counted while you were briefing. 14 that I could identify. There may be others in the classified operational framework I don't have access to. Evelyn looked at him with an expression that was almost amused. Almost. 14, she said. Good to know. Hale was already signaling the crew chief to prep for departure. The aircraft systems were spinning up. Reed felt the slight change in air pressure as the environmental system shifted to pre-flight mode. Outside, the snow was beginning to ease, the storm moving through in the way mountain weather moved, sudden and total, and then gone. Before we go, Reed said. Hale paused. The communications NCO back at the tent, the one in base uniform. Reed looked at the general steadily. He's in custody, but his communication capability was cut the moment Carr locked down the comm building. Assuming he had any kind of check-in protocol with whoever directed the kill team, the missed check-in already signals a failed operation, Hale said. Yes, which means Voss, if it's Voss coordinating directly, already knows the attempt failed. He knows we're alive. He knows the drive potentially survived. Yes. How long do we have before he moves to protect himself through official channels? Reed asked. Files something, makes a record, gets ahead of it. Hale checked his watch. Depends on how rattled he is. If he's disciplined, maybe 12 hours. If he panics, he shrugged. Less. We've been on the ground at Orion for about 4.5 hours, Reed said. He's had at minimum 90 minutes to know the team failed. He may have already started. The cabin was quiet for 2 seconds. Then we're not going to be on the ground much longer, Hale said. They were airborne in 11 minutes, which was fast for a cold weather night departure and spoke to what the flight crew understood about the urgency without being told directly. Reed strapped into the jump seat as the aircraft banked south and the lights of forward base Orion fell away beneath them, small and isolated in the mountain dark. He looked at Evelyn across the narrow cabin. She had the rifle case secured now, everything stowed and latched, and she was sitting with her back straight and her hands on her knees, eyes forward, in the posture of someone who has completed an enormous amount of physical and psychological work and is now running on something that isn't quite energy anymore. She looked tired, not visibly exhausted in the way of someone asking for recognition, just the ordinary biological tired of a person who had spent an extended period at altitude in sub-zero conditions without sleep, managing a long-range engagement, repositioning under fire, and then spending the subsequent hours in high-stakes briefings while trying not to get killed. The dark circles under her eyes were worse in the cabin light than they'd been in the tent. Her hands on her knees weren't quite still. Reed thought about what she'd said on the ridge, what Hale had said about Marcus Reyes. He said he'd want someone to keep using it. He thought about the kind of instructor who would say that, the kind of student who would carry it 11 years and not mention it unless someone looked directly at the crest and asked. He thought about the 14 months of parallel documentation, the decision to go dark, the 11 days alone with information that someone had already killed to protect. He didn't say any of it. There wasn't a version of it that wouldn't have sounded like something it wasn't, and they were both too tired anyway. What? The secure facility was a low building on the southern edge of a regional airfield, the kind of structure designed to look like a maintenance annex and function as something considerably less mundane. It was staffed by 2 people when they arrived at 0720, a technical analyst and the IG contact Hale had called, a woman named Colonel Audra Steins, who had the compact, unhurried manner of someone who had been doing serious work in the dark for long enough that surprises no longer surprised her. She shook Hale's hand, looked at Reed, looked at Evelyn, at the rifle case, at the state of her gear. "You were on the ridge," Steins said. "Yes, ma'am." "Alone?" "Yes, ma'am." Steins absorbed this without comment and led them inside. The facility was warm and slightly too bright after the aircraft in the mountain dark. Reed felt the temperature shift in his hands first, the slow, slightly painful return of full circulation in his fingers that had been cold since the valley floor. He opened and closed his fists twice, quietly, and didn't say anything about it. Steins put the drive into the forensic processing system herself, with Evelyn providing the decryption sequence from memory, a 40-character alphanumeric string that she recited without hesitation or reference to anything written, which told Reed she had been living with this material for a long time. The system processed for 6 minutes. Then Steins read. She read without expression, which was a kind of expression in itself. After 20 minutes, she looked up at Hale. "This is sufficient," she said, for a formal preservation order, a full forensic hold, and a notification to the Secretary of Defense's office that bypasses the Joint Intelligence chain entirely." She paused. "I'll need Commander Cross's statement before I initiate. Start to finish, on record." "Now?" Evelyn asked. "Now," Steins said. "While the timeline is fresh, before anyone has an opportunity to file anything that creates a competing narrative." Reed thought about Hale's estimate. 12 hours if Voss was disciplined, less if he panicked. It was now 0738. "Start with the ridge," Steins said, settling into the chair across from Evelyn with a recording system running. "How you got there, why, and what you did." Evelyn folded her hands on the table in front of her. For a moment she looked at the surface of the table rather than at Steins, and in that moment Reed saw something that had been absent from her face throughout the entire night. Not hesitation, but the particular stillness of someone accessing something they have kept at a managed distance for operational reasons and are now being asked to bring forward. 14 months ago, she began, I flagged an anomaly in a signals intercept that my program director was told to disregard. 8 months ago, I started building a parallel record of the correlation between that anomaly and the operational compromises that followed. 6 months ago, I understood what the record showed. 3 months ago, I identified the source. She looked up at Steins. And 11 days ago, I obtained the direct communication evidence linking that source to the Karev network, at which point I went dark and began looking for a path to get the evidence to someone with the authority and independence to act on it without it being buried or burned. What made you choose General Hale? Steins asked. He wasn't on the original coordination list for last night's operation, Evelyn said. He was assigned to it 48 hours before insertion. That gap between his assignment and the insertion timing was too short for him to have been part of whatever preparation went into the ambush. If he'd been involved from the beginning, the ambush would have been calibrated to account for his presence. She paused. It wasn't. He was supposed to come north after the team died, receive a sanitized after-action, and not ask the right questions. He was a secondary target of opportunity. That made him the safest person I could find. De mon. Steins wrote something down, and Captain Reed's team, the ambush. Walk me through your assessment of what happened and why. Evelyn walked her through it, the same sequence she'd given Hale in the tent, but with more detail now. The specific timeline correlations, the construction timeline for the ridge positions, the repositioning of the compound perimeter guards. Her voice was level and sequential and thorough, and Reed listened to it and thought about the fact that she had been carrying the complete shape of this thing alone for months, turning it over, building the case piece by piece, with no one to check her reasoning against. He thought about how that kind of solitude was its own form of pressure, and about the ways it changed a person over time, and about whether he would have made different decisions in the same position. He was reasonably sure he would not have been as patient. The formal statement took 2 hours and 40 minutes. At the end of it, Steines excused herself to initiate the preservation order and make the calls that needed to be made in a particular sequence and with particular care. Hale went with her. Reed stayed. Evelyn sat back in the chair when the recording system went off and let out a single long breath through her nose. Controlled, quiet, barely audible. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. "You held up well," Reed said. "You don't have to say that." "I know I don't." She dropped her gaze from the ceiling and looked at him. "What happens to your team now? Administratively?" Reed thought about it. Full debrief. Medical evaluation for everyone. Investigation into the mission failure, which will now be investigated as a deliberate compromise rather than an intelligence failure, which changes the administrative classification of everything that happened. He paused. "Marsh is going to get a commendation when he gets out of surgery. Might as well have some paperwork ready." A silence. "The 2 missing perimeter guards," Evelyn said. "From the compound. They survived, presumably. They were on the ridge." "We'll find out. If they're captured and processed, their testimony could support the evidence on the drive. Karev's network had to have a contact inside the command structure for the operational handoff to work. If the guards can identify communication channels, let Steins work that angle," Reed said. "That's what she's for." Evelyn looked at him. "I know how to follow process." "You've been alone with this for 11 days, Reed said. "Sometimes the hardest part of handing something over is actually letting go of it." She held his gaze for a moment, then looked away. "Marsh's wife," she said. "Does she know what actually happened, what he was doing?" "She knows he was on a classified operation and was wounded. She'll know more when the investigation completes." He paused. "She knows the job. They all do." Evelyn nodded, looked at her hands. The facility was quiet around them. The low hum of environmental systems, the distant sound of Steins and Hale in the adjacent room, the occasional crackle of a secure communication line. Outside, through the single high window, the sky was getting lighter. Reed could see the underside of clouds, gray and thick, but the storm had fully passed through, and there was a line of pale winter light at the eastern horizon that was going to become morning, whether anyone was ready for it or not. He was tired. His body had been running on stress chemistry and cold air for the better part of 8 hours, and the warmth of the facility was now actively working against him, pulling at the edges of his alertness like a slow tide. He pressed his back against the wall and kept his eyes open. Evelyn was watching the window. "The crest," Reed said after a while. She looked at him. "You've been wearing it for how long?" She thought about it. 8 years? "And no one's ever—" "People notice," she said. "Nobody asks. Usually." She looked at the window again. "You read what it means. You know who it belonged to. Most people decide they'd rather not open that conversation. Does it help, carrying it?" She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. "It reminds me what the standard is supposed to be," she said finally. "Not just the shooting, all of it, the patience, the judgment about when to fire and when not to." She paused. "Marcus used to say that the shot you don't take defines you as much as the one you do, that most people think sniper work is about shooting. It's actually mostly about deciding not to." Reed thought about 3 gun positions going silent in sequence, about the specific order, east gun first, which was the highest threat to the most exposed members of the team, then west, then north, with the repositioning under fire, the bad angle, the 2,100-meter engagement on a partially offset target. "Last night," he said, "on the ridge, was there a shot you didn't take?" Her expression shifted by a fraction. 4. He waited. 2 of Karev's men repositioned during the engagement. They moved to a secondary position behind the eastern cliff face. Clear shot, both of them. But the angle would have put my rounds downrange toward your team's extraction corridor. She looked at her hands. "And one of your team members broke cover twice during the engagement. I had to calculate his position into every subsequent shot to make sure I wasn't working the same vector." "Yates," Reed said. "It was Yates." "I don't know his name. He's the one who broke right instead of left at the machine gun suppression." "That's Yates. He always breaks right. I've been telling him for 2 years." Reed rubbed his face with one hand. "And the 4th? She was quiet. "The compound," she said. "Karev's compound. After the ridge positions went down, there was a window, maybe 40 seconds, where I had a direct sight line into the compound's main structure. Karev was visible, moving toward a vehicle. The room was very still. "I had the shot," she said. Reed understood the weight of what she was saying. Karev was the target. The entire mission had been built around capturing him. Capturing, not eliminating, because the intelligence value of Viktor Karev alive was an order of magnitude greater than Viktor Karev dead. But Evelyn had been alone on that ridge with no communication, no authorization, no command structure. Just a window of 40 seconds and a sight line. "You didn't take it," he said. "The mission objective was capture," she said. "I didn't have authorization for lethal engagement, and killing him would have destroyed the intelligence value the mission was built around." She paused. "And my angle was imperfect. The wind had shifted in the previous 40 seconds, and I hadn't fully recalibrated. At that range with that wind shift..." She stopped. "You might have missed," Reed said. "I might have wounded," she said. "At that range with that wind, a miss was unlikely. A clean kill was probable. But a wound, a non-fatal hit on a moving target at that distance, with a changed wind, is not outside the margin. And a wounded Karev who makes it to that vehicle is a Karev who disappears into a network we've been trying to map for 2 years. Reed looked at her for a long moment. "So you decided the risk of a bad shot outweighed the certainty of a good one." "I decided the 45% chance of a perfect outcome wasn't worth the 15% chance of an outcome that destroyed everything," she said. "Those numbers might be wrong, but that was my calculation." The door opened. Hale came back in, and behind him Steins, and both of them had the particular energy of people who have just set a large process into motion and are now managing the aftermath. "Preservation order is filed," Steins said. "The SecDef's office has been notified through a channel that Voss cannot access. We have approximately..." She looked at her watch. 6 hours before the formal investigation initiation hits the official record. After that point, any action Voss takes to protect himself becomes obstruction, which adds to the case rather than diminishing it. "And before that 6 hours?" Reed asked. "Before that 6 hours," Stein said, "he can still argue that he's being preemptively targeted by an unauthorized operation run by a soldier who violated a significant number of regulations." She looked at Evelyn. "Which is why your statement on record matters. It establishes the timeline and the intent before he can frame the narrative." "He's already framing it," Hale said. "Carr just got a message through the secure channel. Voss has requested an emergency briefing with the Joint Chiefs at 1000. He's calling it a mission failure review." 6 hours suddenly felt shorter. "He's trying to get ahead of it," Reed said. "He's trying to get in the room first," Hale said. "Once he's in that room and has set the frame..." "He won't get to set the frame," Stein said. She was already reaching for the secure phone on the side table. "Because I'm going to be in that room at 9:30 with evidence that was filed, time-stamped, and preserved before he made his request." She looked at Hale. "Which means you and I need to be on an aircraft in 45 minutes. Hale looked at Reed. "You stay with the commander. Facility is secure, staff is cleared. Don't let anyone through that door who isn't me or Steins." "Understood." Hale looked at Evelyn. For a moment he didn't say anything, just looked at her with an expression that had traveled a long way from the anger that had put him on a helicopter north at 0300. "When this is done," he said, "I'm going to have to file a very long report about the regulations you violated." "Yes, sir," I'm also going to have to include in that report, he said, a complete accounting of what those violations actually accomplished, in full detail, without editorial omission. She held his gaze, understood what he was saying. Yes, sir, she said. I'd expect nothing less. He nodded once. Then he and Steins were moving, pulling on jackets, gathering the drive and its forensic evidence packaging, moving with the efficiency of people who had exactly 45 minutes and a 6-hour window and a full understanding of what was at stake if either ran out before the work was done. The door closed. Reed and Evelyn sat in the facility in the growing morning light. Somewhere to the north, Victor Karev was moving through his network, aware that an ambush had failed and calculating his next position. Somewhere in the capital, Arthur Voss was preparing a briefing that was supposed to be the shovel that buried everything. Somewhere in a military hospital, Sergeant Marsh was in recovery, which was not the same as fine, but was categorically better than the alternative. And in a secure room on the edge of a regional airfield, a woman who had spent 14 months building a case that everyone with the authority to act on it had declined to look at was sitting in a hard chair with her rifle case on the floor beside her, and her hands resting on the table, watching the pale line of morning widen in the window above them. Reed thought about the 4 shots she hadn't taken, about the 45 seconds on the ridge with a sight line to Karev and a shifting wind and a calculation about acceptable margins. He thought about what it costs to hold that kind of patience under that kind of pressure. He thought that the crest on her collar was not decorative. The morning got brighter by degrees, the kind of slow winter light that doesn't commit to anything until it has to. Reed had found coffee somewhere, a machine in the corridor that produced something technically hot and approximately brown, and he was on his second cup when his phone buzzed with a message from the base hospital. Marsh was out of surgery, stable. The round had clipped his subclavian artery and cracked a rib on the way through, and he had lost enough blood in the valley to require 4 units in the OR. But the surgeon's note used the word favorable, and in Reed's experience, that word from that particular professional category was not deployed carelessly. He set the phone down on the table, looked at it for a moment. Marsh is out, he said. Evelyn looked up from the chair she'd been sitting in for the past hour, not sleeping, but also not quite awake in the usual sense. Some intermediate state of conserved energy that Reed associated with people who had learned to rest in the gaps, rather than waiting for the right conditions. Good, she said. One word. But her shoulders dropped approximately 3 millimeters, and Reed noticed. He didn't say anything about it. Basit. Steins called at 0917. Reed put it on speaker without asking Evelyn's permission, which she didn't comment on. We're at the building, Stein said. She sounded like someone walking fast through a corridor. Voss is already here. He brought legal. 2 people from JAG who aren't his assigned counsel, which means he called in a favor, which means he's been preparing this longer than we thought. How long? Reed asked. The JAG request was filed at 0340, Steins said. 40 minutes after the kill team missed its check-in. Reed looked at Evelyn. She was already doing the math. He could see it in the way her eyes moved slightly left, the way people's do when they're working a sequence in their head. He had a contingency ready, Evelyn said, loud enough for the phone. He didn't build the legal response after the failure. He built it before, in case the kill team failed. That's consistent with what we're seeing, Stein said. He filed a preemptive mission failure report at 0400. It's already in the official record. He's framing last night as a rogue operation, an unauthorized asset interfering in a classified mission and nearly triggering a diplomatic incident. His own kill team, Reed said. He's not acknowledging the kill team. There's no record of it. The 3 men at the tent are private contractors with no documented connection to his office. And the base uniform NCO is currently, according to Voss's version, an unrelated personnel issue that should be processed through base command. Reed put both hands flat on the table. He's going to walk. He's trying to, Stein said. He does not have the full picture yet. He doesn't know what's on the drive, he doesn't know I have a time-stamped preservation order, and he doesn't know that Commander Cross's statement is on record as of 0840. A pause. We are walking into that briefing room in 11 minutes. General Hale will present. I will present the evidentiary record. After that, it either holds or it doesn't. What do you need from us? Reed asked. Stay where you are. Stay reachable. And if anyone contacts you, anyone from any chain above base level that isn't me or General Hale, Do not respond until you hear from us first. Understood. The line went quiet for a moment. Then Stein said, at a slightly lower register, Commander Cross. Ma'am, Evelyn said, your statement was thorough and your timeline documentation is clean. Whatever happens in the next 2 hours, you gave us what we needed to work with. A pause. That matters. The call ended. The facility hummed around them. Reed finished his coffee. Evelyn stood and walked to the window and looked at the airfield outside. The low gray sky, the parked aircraft, the ground crew moving between buildings in the cold. Normal operational morning. Nothing on the outside to indicate that 11 minutes away in a briefing room, the shape of the next several years of military prosecutorial history was being argued over a conference table. He's better prepared than I expected, she said, mostly to herself. You expected him to be prepared, Reed said. I expected the broad outlines, not the JAG preposition. She turned from the window. He filed that at 0340. The check-in failure was 0310 at the earliest. That's 30 minutes to draft a formal preemptive report and get it into the official record through a back channel. Or he drafted it earlier, Reed said, as a contingency before the kill team went in. She looked at him. He knew the kill team might fail, Reed said. He's been doing this for 14 months. He knows what failure looks like and he knows how to respond to it. The JAG request was probably written 3 days ago and dated last night. Evelyn sat back down. She pressed 2 fingers to the inside of her wrist briefly. Not a gesture Reed recognized as self-soothing, more like checking something, confirming a pulse that she apparently needed to confirm. Her hands were steadier than they'd been an hour ago, but she'd also eaten something, a protein bar from the facility's supply cabinet. And the difference between fed and rested and neither was visible in the fine muscles around her eyes. 14 months, she said, and in 11 minutes it either holds or it doesn't. Yeah. She looked at the rifle case on the floor, then at the table, then at nothing in particular, which was the look of a person thinking about a calculation they've already run and can't run again. If it doesn't hold, she said, the evidentiary record is still preserved. Steins has the drive, the chain of custody documentation, my statement. Even if Voss suppresses it today, it exists. It can be accessed in a future proceeding. That's a long game. It's the only game I have left to play, she said. 40 minutes passed. Then 50. The phone didn't ring. At 01040, Reed's personal secure channel buzzed with a message from Falco. Terse, the way Falco communicated when he was managing something. Team's been pulled for formal debrief. JAG on site. Someone's calling it a rogue op. What do I tell them? Reed typed back. Tell them the truth in sequence. Don't speculate. Don't volunteer. Just sequence. Falco's response came in 8 seconds. Sequence is ugly. I know, Reed typed. Tell it anyway. He put the phone down and told Evelyn. She listened without changing expression. Voss is trying to build the narrative from the ground up, she said. If he can get the team to frame last night as a rogue interference that jeopardized their extraction, Falco won't do that. He might not have a choice about how the questions are structured. Falco's been in JAG debriefs before, Reed said. He knows how to answer what's asked without answering what wasn't. She accepted that. Reed believed it himself, mostly. Falco was good. But good wasn't the same as untouchable, and a JAG attorney working from a pre-built narrative had structural advantages that straight-up competence couldn't always overcome. The minutes kept going. At 01104, the door to the facility opened. Reed was on his feet before the handle finished turning. Not dramatically, just the automatic response of someone who had been maintaining alert status in an unfamiliar environment for the past 3 hours. His hand went to the sidearm at his hip, and then stopped when he saw Hale come through the door. Hale looked like a man who had been in a difficult room for 90 minutes, and had come out of it still standing, which was not the same as looking like a man who had won. His jacket was on, his tie was straight, but there was something around his eyes that suggested the kind of sustained pressure that leaves a mark even after it's lifted. Steins came through behind him. Reed looked at both of them and waited. He's been removed from his position, Hale said, pending formal investigation. Administrative hold on all security clearances, all operational access. He's not to be in contact with anyone in the joint intelligence chain until the investigation completes. Evelyn stood slowly. The evidence held. The evidence held, Hale said. The timestamp on the preservation order was filed 42 minutes before Voss's JAG request, which means his preemptive report was filed in response to an already existing evidentiary record, which legally inverts the framing he was trying to establish. He paused. His attorneys argued it for 40 minutes. They're good. It didn't matter. Reed let out a breath that he hadn't completely acknowledged he'd been holding. The kill team, Evelyn said, the contractors. Forensic financial trace is active, Stein said. The NCO at Orion is in military custody and has been read his rights and offered counsel. Based on the first 20 minutes of that conversation, he is not inclined to absorb this alone. She looked at Evelyn steadily. The evidence chain you built, the 14 months of parallel documentation, is what allowed us to contextualize everything the NCO says. Without your record, his testimony would be easy to isolate and discredit. With it, he becomes corroborating rather than primary. Evelyn nodded, said nothing. There's something else, Hale said. He moved to the table and sat down, which was a thing he had not done since arriving, and the sitting itself communicated something about the weight of what came next. Voss's JAG team raised a counter-complaint, he said. Formal. 14 violations of operational security protocol attributed to Commander Cross. Unauthorized field operation. Unauthorized discharge of a weapon in a classified zone. Failure to report to chain of command. 11 days of unauthorized intelligence retention. 14 violations, Evelyn said. I'm aware. The counter-complaint is in the record, Hale said. It can't be removed. Even with Voss suspended, the complaint itself exists and will be processed by a separate investigation track. He looked at her directly. You're going to face a formal review board. I expected that. The outcome is not guaranteed, Hale said. The evidence you provided, the lives saved last night, that context will be part of the record, but the violations are real, and the board will be independent. I understand. Your program director has been notified. Hale paused for a fraction of a second. He's not happy. About the dark period. About the methods. I know. He's also the one who flagged Voss to the IG 6 months ago and was told his concerns were outside his lane, Stein said. That's on record now, too. Context the board will have access to. Evelyn absorbed this without visible reaction, but something behind her eyes was doing something that Reed couldn't quite read. He thought it might have been relief. Not clean relief, not the simple kind, but the specific relief of a person who has been carrying a structure of calculated decisions alone for a long time, and has just been told that the record of those decisions is complete enough that someone else can now read it accurately. Captain Reed, Hale said, your team's debrief. Falco messaged JAG on site. I know, I've spoken with the lead investigator. The debrief will proceed as a mission compromise investigation rather than a rogue operation inquiry. That changes the framing of every question they can legally ask. He paused. Your team's testimony will be recorded under the correct operational classification. Reed thought about Falco in a debrief room right now, telling the sequence in his precise economical way, about Yates and Torres and the others, about the valley floor and the machine guns and the shots that had come from the ridge without anyone asking for them. What happens to Karev? He asked. He's moved, Hale said. The mission failure and the compromise of the original operational plan means he knows the approach corridor was identified. He'll have relocated his network by now. A pause. But the intelligence file Evelyn's program developed on the financial chain, that's intact. Combined with what the NCO can provide about the communication structure Voss used, it maps a portion of Karev's domestic interface that we didn't have before. So he escapes, Reed said. For now, Hale said. Reed thought about Marsh in a hospital bed with 4 units of someone else's blood in him. Thought about the 2 operators from a different team 6 months ago that Evelyn had mentioned obliquely. The ones whose deaths had been attributed to tradecraft failure. Thought about the careful, patient construction of a kill zone in a mountain corridor, and the months of preparation it had required, and the fact that all of that preparation had been enabled by a general sitting in a warm office passing operational details for money. For now, Reed said. It was an agreement. It was just the only available response. Steins excused herself to manage the next stage of the evidentiary process, And Hale spent 30 minutes on the secure phone working through the administrative cascade that a suspended flag officer created. The reassignments, the access revocations, the careful management of who knew what at which point. Reed sat and listened to the half of the conversations he could hear and reconstructed the other half from Hale's responses. Evelyn went outside. She came back 12 minutes later with cold in her jacket, and something settled in her expression that hadn't been there before. Reed didn't ask where she'd been. The airfield outside had a perimeter fence and a security checkpoint, and beyond that it was open country, and sometimes people needed 400 meters of cold open air more than they needed anything anyone could say to them. Hale finished his calls, looked at his watch, looked at Evelyn. "The review board will convene in approximately 2 weeks," he said. "In the interim, your operational status is suspended. You'll need to report to your program's administrative officer and remain available for investigative interviews." He paused. "Do you understand the terms of the suspension?" "Yes, sir." "Is there anything you need right now that falls within what I can actually provide?" The question surprised her slightly. Reed could see it in the brief shift of her attention. It was a more human question than she'd apparently been expecting from him at this point in the conversation. She thought about it honestly. "I'd like to know that the team from last night gets a full and accurate account of what happened," she said. "Not a sanitized version. The full sequence. Why the ambush was there, who built it, why they walked into it. They were targeted deliberately by someone in their own chain. They deserve to know that." Hale held her gaze. "I'll make sure that happens." "And Marsh," she said, "when he's recovered enough, I'd like the opportunity to speak with him directly. Not formally, just—" She stopped. "I'll make a note of it," Hale said. There was no trace of formality in how he said it. A silence settled. Not the tense operational silence of the previous hours, but something different. The particular quiet that comes when acute pressure has passed, and the longer, slower work of consequence has begun. "General," Reed said. Hale looked at him. "The intelligence officer from the original brief, Decker." Reed kept his voice even. "He briefed that operation with what he called a reliable asset, 12 months in place. I flagged it in the room, and he pushed back." "Decker is currently under a parallel review," Hale said. "He's not a named subject, not yet, but his role in the operational authorization chain is being examined." He paused. "Whether he was complicit or simply used is one of the questions that needs answering." "He was convincing," Reed said. "In the brief. Very certain." "People who are being used often are," Hale said. "It's part of what makes them useful." Reed thought about that, filed it away in the category of things that were true and uncomfortable and not particularly actionable right now. Hale stood, straightened his jacket, looked at both of them with the expression of a man who has arrived at the end of the acute phase of something and is already thinking about what the next phase requires. "Captain Reed," he said, "your team debrief will be complete by this afternoon. I want you present for the close of that session. You'll be given the opportunity to provide command context before the record is finalized." "Yes, sir." "Commander Cross." He looked at her for a moment without speaking, which was its own communication. "I will be providing a full accounting to the review board, in writing, under my signature, of everything I observed last night and this morning." He paused. "That is not a small thing, and I want you to understand that it is offered without conditions." Evelyn straightened slightly. Not to attention, just the natural response of a person receiving something they understand the full weight of. "Thank you, sir." He picked up his cover from the table, looked at the rifle case on the floor. "That weapon," he said, "is currently unauthorized in this facility." "Yes, sir. As of this moment, I am authorizing its temporary presence for the duration of your administrative hold." He put his cover on. "Because I'm told it's been through enough already." He left. Reed looked at Evelyn. She was looking at the door. "He's going to be a problem," she said. Reed raised an eyebrow. "The board," she said. "He's going to advocate, loudly, and that's going to create its own complications. A 4-star going to bat for a suspended operator has political dimensions that could cut either way. Or it could just work," Reed said. She looked at him. "Things don't just work. Sometimes they do," he said. "Not often. Not cleanly. But sometimes the evidence is what it is and the record is what it is, and the person making the case is credible enough that the outcome is not guaranteed, but probable." She considered that. Probable. Better than possible, he said. She picked up the rifle case and set it on the table, opened it, looked at the weapon inside, clean, complete, everything where it should be, closed it again. 14 violations, she said quietly. Yeah. 11 of which I would do exactly the same way again. Reed almost smiled. And the other 3? She thought about it. The dark period was probably 2 days longer than it needed to be. I could have reached Hale 48 hours earlier if I'd moved on incomplete information. She paused. And I should have flagged the ridge position to someone before I took it. Even if there was no one to flag it to in the official chain, I should have found a way to create a record. That's 2. She was quiet for a moment. The third one I'm still working out. Reed nodded. He thought he understood. Not which violation, but the fact that there was one she was still holding, turning over, checking from different angles. That was the kind of accounting that didn't resolve quickly and didn't respond to external pressure. His phone buzzed. Falco again. Debrief wrapping. You should be here for close. Reed stood, picked up his jacket. I have to go, he said. Evelyn nodded, didn't move from the table. He was at the door when she said, Reed. He turned. She was looking at the rifle case, not at him. The second time Yates broke cover in the valley, she said, he moved left instead of right. Reed waited. Tell him that, she said. When you see him. He broke right the first time, but the second time he read the suppression pattern and adjusted. Left was the right call. She paused. He doesn't know that. Tell him. Reed stood in the doorway for a moment. Thought about what it means to track 12 people across a valley in a blizzard from 1,900 meters in the dark. To know not just where they are, but how they move, which ones are thinking, which ones are running on instinct, which ones are learning in real time. I'll tell him, he said. He went out into the cold. The cold hit Reed the moment he stepped outside, and he walked toward the debrief building with his collar up and his hands in his pockets, thinking about Yates breaking left on the second cover movement and a woman on a ridge 1,900 meters away who had noticed and cataloged it in the middle of an active engagement. He thought about what it takes to see that clearly under that kind of pressure. He thought about it the whole walk across the airfield. The debrief closed at 14:20. Falco gave his testimony in the precise, unhurried sequence of someone who has thought carefully about the difference between what he knows and what he inferred, and kept those 2 categories clean throughout. Yates was shakier, not dishonest, just younger, and the JAG investigator assigned to the session had a technique of asking the same question from 3 different angles that rattled people who weren't expecting it. But he held. Torres held. The others held. When Reed came in for the command context session, the investigator, a major named Okafor, compact and careful, with the kind of neutral professional manner that gave nothing away, handed him a summary sheet and asked him to confirm or contest the factual record. Reed read it, made 2 corrections, a timeline discrepancy on the first contact report and a characterization of the extraction that implied disorganized withdrawal rather than deliberate tactical break contact. Both corrections were logged without argument. Captain, Okafor said at the end, in your assessment, did the unidentified fire support from the ridge position contribute to your team's survival? Reed looked at the table, thought about 12 men in a kill zone, about the eastern gun going silent before Falco could reposition, about the 40 seconds of open extraction corridor that had not existed before it did. Yes, he said. Without qualification? Without qualification. Okafor wrote something. Thank you, Captain. Outside the debrief building, Falco was waiting. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, watching the airfield with the expression he always wore when he was processing something that didn't fit neatly into any category he already had. The woman, Falco said when Reed came out. Not a question. What about her? Rumors moving through the team. Someone said she was on the ridge alone. He paused. All 3 gun positions. Yeah. Falco was quiet for a moment. He had the particular stillness of a man who has been in enough bad situations to understand exactly what it means when a gun position stops firing. What's going to happen to her? Review board in 2 weeks. She going to be okay? Reed thought about the 14 violations, and the 11 she'd do the same way again, and the third one she was still working out. I think so. Not a certainty, but probable. Falco nodded, filed it. Yates, Reed said. What about him? The second time he broke cover in the valley, he went left. Falco thought back. Yeah, that was the right call. The suppression pattern had shifted. Left was the correct read. Reed looked at his sergeant. Tell him. He doesn't know. Falco absorbed this. Then he looked at Reed with the particular expression of a man recalibrating what he thought he knew about the distance between the valley floor and a ridge 1,900 meters away. She tracked all of us, Falco said. Apparently. Another silence. Buy her a drink sometime, Falco said. When this is over. I'll pass that along. Bus. The 2 weeks that followed were not clean or simple because 2 weeks involving a suspended flag officer, a formal evidentiary investigation, a classified program review, and a parallel military prosecution were structurally incapable of being either. Reed spent most of it in rooms answering questions, reviewing transcripts, and waiting for processes that moved at the pace institutional machinery always moved, which is to say, slower than the situation demanded and faster than anyone with a lawyer present wanted. Arthur Voss did not go quietly. That was the thing Reed probably should have predicted and hadn't quite the specific texture of a senior officer's resistance when they have resources and connections, and the particular conviction of someone who has operated in a gray zone long enough to believe the gray zone will protect them the way it always has. Voss's legal team filed 4 separate motions in the first 9 days. 2 were dismissed outright. One was partially upheld on a technicality involving the classification level of a specific document in the evidentiary chain, which required Steins to refile under a different authority, which cost 36 hours. The 4th motion argued that the entire evidentiary record should be excluded on the basis that it had been developed by an operator acting outside lawful authorization, that Evelyn Cross's 14 violations effectively tainted everything she had gathered, making the drive inadmissible in any formal proceeding. That motion went to a 3-judge military panel. Reed was in a corridor outside a different room entirely when Steins called him with the outcome. Denied, she said. All 3 judges. The panel's reasoning was that the exclusionary logic Voss's team applied would require suppressing evidence of criminal activity because the person who discovered it was also committing a lesser infraction. The panel found that application both legally incorrect and I'm quoting here, contrary to the reasonable functioning of military justice. Reed leaned against the corridor wall. What does that mean practically? It means the drive is in, the communications metadata is in, the financial records are in. Everything Evelyn documented for 14 months is in the formal record and cannot be excluded. A pause. It means Voss is going to trial. Evelyn's review board convened on a Thursday in a building that smelled of institutional carpet and recycled air before 5 officers Reed didn't know, and one he did, Colonel Audra Steins, who had been appointed to the board as the officer with the most direct knowledge of the operational context. Reed was not in the room. He was in an anteroom with a cup of bad coffee, waiting, which was the correct place for him to be, and also not a place he was particularly comfortable. The board session ran for 4 hours and 11 minutes. When Evelyn came out, she looked the way people look after extended formal interrogation. Not broken, not relieved, just emptied out in a specific way that takes time to refill. She was carrying the jacket she'd worn into the session over one arm, which meant the room had been too warm, which meant she'd been uncomfortable for 4 hours and 11 minutes without being able to address it, which was a small detail that somehow made the whole thing more real. She looked at Reed. He looked at her. Well, he said. She sat down in the chair across from him. Letter of reprimand, she said. Formal. Goes in the record permanently. And 60-day administrative suspension, already served. She looked at the jacket on her arm. Mandatory program review set. The whole operation, all 14 months, every decision point. An oversight officer assigned to the program for 18 months going forward. She paused. Operational reinstatement conditional on program review completion. Reed worked through it. They're reinstating you. Conditional. But reinstating. Yes. He let out a breath. That's a good outcome, Evelyn. She looked at him briefly. He'd used her first name without thinking about it, and she registered it but didn't comment. It's a fair outcome, she said. I'm not sure they're the same thing. What's the difference? She thought about it. A good outcome would have been 14 months ago, she said, when the anomaly was first flagged and someone with the authority to act on it did. She set the jacket on her knee. What happened instead was that it took 14 months, 11 days dark, 3 dead contractors, 1 hospitalized operator, and a review board to get to the same place we could have been in week 1. Reed didn't have a counter to that. It was accurate. But, she said, and there was something in the word, not brightness, not forced resolution, just the particular weight of a person who has worked very hard to understand the difference between what should have happened and what did. The record is complete now. Everything I built, everything Stein's documented, everything Hale presented. It's in the formal record permanently. It can't be buried. It can't be reassigned to a footnote. She paused. Voss is going to trial. The NCO took a deal and his testimony maps the communication structure Voss used. 3 of Karev's domestic contacts have been identified from that map. Karev himself is still moving, she said. Yes, but his network inside our command structure is burned. He lost his primary intelligence source. The financial channel Voss was using, frozen. He's operating blind on the domestic side now. She looked at the carpet. He'll rebuild eventually. These people always do. But it costs time and money and trust, and all 3 of those are finite. Reed looked at his coffee cup. Thought about the valley and the machine guns and the 12 men who'd been in it. Thought about the version of that night where no one was on the ridge, where the guns didn't stop. Marsh is out of hospital, he said. Got discharged this morning. She looked up. He's going to need 6 weeks of physical rehab before he's cleared for anything, Reed said, and then a psych evaluation before return to operational status. The whole process will probably take 4 months. He paused. He asked about you. Her expression shifted. I told him who you were, Reed said, what you did. He took it quietly. You know how some people take things quietly in a way that's actually very loud? Yes, that's how Marsh took it. Reed set down the coffee cup. He wants to meet you. Not formally, he said he'd like to shake your hand at some point when the paperwork is done. Evelyn looked at the jacket on her knee. Something in her face moved, briefly, in a direction that she didn't try to manage or redirect. It was there for a moment, and then it was gone, replaced by the composed, even expression she'd worn since the tent at Orion. But it had been there, and Reed had seen it, and he didn't say anything about it because some things communicate better without being named. When the paperwork is done, she said. Yeah. She nodded. Untouchable. Arthur Voss's court-martial began 6 weeks later and ran for 11 days. Reed testified on day 4. He was in the witness chair for 3 hours, walking through the mission brief, the insertion, the ambush, the moments after the guns stopped. Voss's defense attorney was skilled, genuinely skilled, the kind that asks questions in a way that makes the answer they want seem like the natural conclusion. And Reed had been deposed enough times to recognize the technique and know how to respond to it without being evasive and without being helpful to a conclusion he didn't support. He described the missing perimeter guards, the prepared ridge positions, the corridor selection that had been in the operational plan that was supposed to have been classified at the level that only a handful of people could access. Captain Reed, the defense attorney said toward the end, isn't it possible that the intelligence failure that led to last night's ambush was simply that? A failure. Bad intelligence, bad luck, the fog of war. Rather than the deliberate orchestration you've described? Reed looked at him. The fighting positions in those cliffs took months to construct, he said. Someone with foreknowledge of our operational corridor and our timeline provided the information necessary for that construction to go undetected. Bad luck doesn't dig fighting positions. Could the enemy have... The enemy would have needed to know which corridor we were using, Reed said, and when, months in advance. That information was classified at a level that required command authorization to access. Bad luck doesn't have a security clearance. A silence in the room. The defense attorney moved on. The verdict came back on a Friday afternoon. Guilty on all primary counts, breach of national security, conspiracy to commit murder of military personnel, unlawful communication with a foreign national, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Reed was not in the courtroom for the verdict. He was in a hospital corridor in a different building, sitting in a plastic chair beside Falco, waiting for Marsh to finish his rehab session. Marsh came out of the physical therapy room walking under his own power. Not easily, not without cost, but walking. He had lost weight in the hospital and not yet fully recovered it, and his left shoulder sat slightly different than his right from the reconstruction, and he walked with the careful precision of someone who is managing discomfort without advertising it. He saw Reed and Falco and stopped, looked at both of them. His expression did the thing that faces do when they're holding more than they know how to express in a corridor outside a physical therapy room. "You look terrible," Falco said. "I feel great," Marsh said, "relative to 3 weeks ago." "That's not a high bar." "No," Marsh agreed. "It's not." Reed stood. They did not hug. That was not the vocabulary of this particular group. But Reed put a hand on Marsh's right shoulder, and Marsh held still for it, and the duration of that contact said what it needed to say. "The verdict?" Marsh asked. "Guilty," Reed said. "All counts." Marsh absorbed that. His jaw moved slightly. "Good," he said. One word, flat and final, the way some people say things they have been holding for a long time and are now letting go of. 3 days after the verdict, in the late afternoon of a day that had started overcast and was ending clear, Evelyn Cross walked into a military hospital rehab facility and asked at the front desk for Staff Sergeant David Marsh. She was not in uniform. She was wearing civilian clothes, dark jacket, plain, the kind that don't call attention to themselves. And she was carrying nothing except a small paper bag from a deli near the building that held a sandwich she had been told by Reed on the phone the previous day that Marsh had specifically mentioned wanting but couldn't get delivered. The desk directed her to the 3rd floor. She found the room, knocked on the open door. Marsh was sitting in the chair beside his bed, the way people sit in hospital rooms when they're well enough not to be in the bed, but not yet well enough to be elsewhere. He looked up when she knocked, took her in, the civilian clothes, the paper bag, the absence of anything formal about her bearing in this context. "Commander Cross," he said. "Just Evelyn," she said. "Right now." He nodded, looked at the paper bag. "Reed told me," she said. She set the bag on the bedside table. Marsh looked at it for a moment, then at her. He had the kind of face that showed calculation, not suspicion, but the honest working out of something. "I've been thinking about what to say," he said. "Since Reed told me who was on the ridge, I had it pretty well organized in my head." He paused. "And now I don't know where I put it." "You don't have to say anything." "I know." He looked at his shoulder, the left one, the reconstructed one. "I was in the valley for about 40 seconds before I went down. I didn't hear your shots. By the time I was aware of anything again, I was in a medevac." He paused. "Reed told me the sequence. East gun first." "Yes." "That was the gun that was targeting the position I was in when I was hit," he said. Evelyn was quiet. "If you'd gotten to it 30 seconds earlier," he stopped, started again. "I'm not saying that as a complaint. I'm saying it because I want you to know that I understand the margin." He looked at her directly. "You were 1,900 meters away in a blizzard. 30 seconds is not a failure. I know what 30 seconds is at that distance under those conditions. I've been in the field long enough to know." "It wasn't 30 seconds, she said. "It was 11. He blinked. "I was on that position for 6 minutes before your team hit the compound," she said. "The east gun was occupied from the start. I had the operator in my scope at 11 seconds before he fired the first shot." She paused. "I didn't have authorization for preemptive engagement. If I fired before your team was in contact, it would have compromised the mission and confirmed that someone on our side had foreknowledge of the ambush's location." Marsh stared at her. "So I waited," she said, "for the signal shot, for contact to be established, for the engagement to be legally and operationally justified." She looked at the bedside table. 11 seconds. The room was quiet. "I've been thinking about those 11 seconds since the moment I took the shot," she said. "I will probably think about them for a long time." Marsh was very still. "You made the right call," he said. "Operationally." "I know." "That doesn't make it easy." "No," she said. "It doesn't." They sat with that for a moment, Two people in a hospital room on a clear afternoon holding a conversation that most people would find incomprehensible and that both of them understood completely. "The sandwich," Marsh said eventually. She almost smiled. Reed said pastrami. "Reed is occasionally useful," Marsh said. Imagine. Evelyn's program review completed in 7 weeks, 2 ahead of schedule, which was the kind of outcome that happens when the oversight officer assigned to the review discovers that the documentation is already thorough enough to answer every question before it's asked. The conditional on her reinstatement was lifted on a Wednesday morning with a single-line administrative notice that offered no fanfare and required no ceremony. She was standing in a parking lot when she got the notification on her phone. She read it twice, put the phone in her pocket, stood in the cold for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then she walked to her vehicle and drove to the training facility. The rifle needed recalibration after the weeks of inactivity, or more precisely, she needed recalibration, the slow resynchronization of body and weapon that degraded without consistent practice. She spent 4 hours on the range, working at progressively longer distances, starting at 500 meters and building out. By the time she reached 1,500, the groupings were where she expected them. By 2,000, they were where Marcus Reyes had told her they should be. She packed the rifle and sat on the bench at the end of the range for a while. General Hale called at 17:30. She answered on the second ring. "Administrative reinstatement is confirmed," he said. "I got the notice. The program director wants to discuss active operations. There's a development on the financial chain Stein's identified, a branch of Karov's network that the prosecution's evidence mapped that we hadn't previously tracked. I heard. He'll want you operational within the month. I'll be ready." A pause on the line. Hale pausing was different from most people pausing. It had weight to it, the specific quality of a man choosing words rather than reaching for them. "The review board's letter of reprimand," he said. "It's in your file permanently." "I know." "My written statement supporting your reinstatement is also in your file permanently," he said, in full detail. Evelyn looked at the empty range, at the target frames at 2,000 meters, small and precise in the fading afternoon light. "General," she said. "Yes. The last time someone put their name on something to support me through official channels." "I know," he said. "I read what happened to your program director. I read what happened to your source." He paused. "I'm not them. And the situation is different now. Voss's network inside the command structure has been mapped and addressed. The contamination is documented." Another pause. "I'm not telling you the risk is zero. I'm telling you that I made a decision with full information." Evelyn held the phone for a moment. "Thank you, sir," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "Be operational." The call ended. She sat on the bench for another few minutes in the quiet of an empty range at the end of a winter afternoon, with the rifle case on her knee and the cold working through her jacket and the pale last light of the day touching the targets at distance. She thought about 14 months, about the anomaly that should have been sufficient and wasn't, about the source who was dead, about the program director and his administrative posting, about 11 seconds and a shot she'd been legally and operationally correct to wait for and would never fully stop accounting for. She thought about Marsh eating a pastrami sandwich in a hospital room on a clear afternoon, about Reed in a debrief room saying without qualification, about Hale reading the first file on an air-gapped terminal in the gray light of an aircraft cabin, the color leaving his face, about Marcus Reyes in a training facility 8 years ago, setting a crest on the table between them and saying, "A crest in a case isn't doing anyone any good." She stood, picked up the rifle case, walked toward the parking lot. She did not look back at the range. There was nothing left to look at. The work that needed doing was not behind her, and the accounting she owed was not to the past, but to the next time the right decision would be difficult, and the wrong one would be easier, and someone would have to make the call anyway. She got in the vehicle and drove. Victor Karov was arrested 11 weeks later in a city 600 kilometers from the Black Ridge Mountains by a team working from the financial intelligence that the prosecution's evidence had surfaced, and that Evelyn's program had spent the intervening weeks developing into an operational picture. The arrest was unspectacular. A man in civilian clothes coming out of a building, a team moving fast from 3 directions, no shooting. The domestic contact network that Voss had enabled for 14 months had been burned to the point of non-functionality, and without it, Karev had been navigating blind and had made the kind of small navigational error that blind men make. The sentencing in Voss's court-martial came back the same week. 31 years. No parole eligibility for the first 15. He was remanded immediately. Reed heard about both on the same day, in a message from Falco that said simply, "Both done. Beer sometime." He typed back, "Name the place." Nobody threw a ceremony for what Evelyn Cross had done. That was not how these things worked, and she would not have attended one anyway. The people who knew, knew. The people who didn't were not entitled to the information. That was the nature of the work, and she had understood the nature of the work since before she was old enough to fully understand why she'd chosen it. What happened instead was smaller and more real. A message from Marsh, 4 months after the hospital, on the day he was cleared for full operational return. It said, "Back on the line, thought you'd want to know. DM." Nothing else. No flourish, just the fact of it, which was the only thing that mattered. She kept that one. She didn't keep many things. She had learned over years of work that required moving quickly and leaving little trace, that attachment to objects was a liability, and that most things could be replaced or discarded without meaningful loss. The places she'd been, the operations she'd run, the long hours in positions that were cold and uncomfortable and solitary, those left marks that weren't external and couldn't be inventoried. The crest on her collar was the exception. She wore it the same way she always had, without announcement, without explanation, as a standard rather than a display. Most people who saw it decided not to ask. The ones who did ask received the answer plainly and without elaboration. It belonged to Marcus Reyes. He gave it to me. And then she moved on, because the work was always ahead of her and never behind, and the standard was not something you explained, but something you kept meeting, one decision at a time, in the cold and the dark and the difficult space between what's easy and what's right. Some people spend their entire lives waiting to be believed by the people who were supposed to believe them from the beginning. What matters in the end is not whether they waited, it is that they didn't stop.